Hey, somebody's got to flip these lights on. That one too. Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to The Professional Noticer. Here, you and I will use common sense and all the wisdom we can muster to move beyond what is true and go all the way to the truth. With actual listeners in more than 100 countries, I am The Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here, today and with every show we do, is to play the part of a best friend or a coach. I want to help you live the life you would live by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. Our sponsor this week is Tucker ATV. Tucker ATV in Jackson, Alabama is the most awesome place to, if you want an ATV, if you're going to get an ATV anyway, you need to go to Tucker ATV. If you're going to get any power tools, they got all the Echo stuff. Not just what the big box carries, they got everything. And the Hustler lawn equipment, all that zero-turn stuff. But man, the Polaris ATVs and these big Ranger Cruise, this is just great stuff. But the reason you want to go to Tucker ATV is not just the stuff, it's the place too. I mean, it's become a destination. I mean, there's antiques in there, there's taxidermy, there is a taxidermy deer from the world champion, literally the guy who won best in the world in taxidermy last year. That's there. There's an indoor porch with a swing, free coffee. It's an awesome, listen, but there's a reason people from 14 states are doing business with Tucker ATV. And it's really Shannon and Lisa. The customer service is the very best because they own the place. You got to stop in and see them. Go on their Facebook page. Read the stuff Lisa writes. There's some funny stuff. These guys are awesome. Tucker ATV in Jackson, Alabama. This is Highway 43 North. Tucker ATV, the small town business with the national reputation. Observations and answers, that's what we do here at The Professional Noticer. And that's what I try to do during my spare time. Do I have any spare time? I don't think I have any spare time, but in the time that seems spare, early in the mornings, I get up and write. And so observations and answers are what happens when I write. And I wrote The Noticer years ago, and that has been a favorite book of a lot of people. And then I wrote The Noticer Returns, which what an imaginative title for the sequel. Yeah, I mean, you can just imagine the publisher. We've got The Noticer. All right, he's written the sequel. What should we call it? The Noticer Returns. Wow, it just gives me chills. But now, coming out September 8th and available for pre-order now, I'm supposed to say that, available for pre-order now, is the third in the Noticer series. The book is called Just Jones. Sometimes a thing seems impossible until it is actually done. So Just Jones was a lot of fun to write. Took longer than I thought, but everything I write takes longer than I thought. But I got to spend a ton of time in research on this, and I probably did as much research on the prologue as I did the rest of the book. Today, for this particular podcast, I'm going to read to you, I hope that's okay, I'm going to read the prologue and the first two chapters. And this prologue, I always enjoy doing prologues because I love to take something that happened a long time ago and then connect it to the body of the story, connect it to modern day events. And so this prologue, we go back as far as we can possibly go. But I'm telling you, I did a ton of research on this prologue that just really kind of blew me away to find out the truth about a lot of the stuff. So all the research I did on this prologue is true. It's adapted from the historical record of the Muskogee Nation. Later became the Creek Nation, but this was their very beginnings, and this was how they saw God and who God's son was and who the devil was. And it's very curious to see what they had believed thousands of years before the white man ever set foot on the continent. They were monotheistic. They believed in one God, and his name was Hese Getamase. God's son was, it is spelled Cesvs and pronounced Savus. So very, very curious. You'll hear, but let's get started. I'm going to read the prologue first. The prologue: the land between two rivers at the time of emergence. It was the first story to be told. In the beginning, Hese Getamase created sky and dirt and water. Soon he made the eagle to guard the sky, corn to spring from the dirt, and fish to keep the bugs out of the water. Seeing that it was all good, Hese Getamase then made his children. In the moment of first breath, Hese Getamase swept his left hand across the land and spread a giant cloud of fog around his children. They could not see each other and were quickly separated. Groups began to form as they located first one, then another in the mist. But as they tried to find their way, each group moved farther from the others. When the fog finally began to blow away, the people who were first able to see called themselves the Wind Clan. As the fog cleared from all the land, clans took their names from the first things they saw, and so became the bear, deer, turkey, alligator, raccoon, and bird clans. By this time, just as Hese Getamase had intended, his children had scattered to the four directions. Some went to the rising sun. Some wandered the other way and made their homes where the sun hides itself in the darkness. Many journeyed into the cold wind until they had to build shelter, while most of the rest walked until coming to the big water. There, it is said that Hese Getamase fed them with food from inside wet stones. Of all Hese Getamase's children, only the Wind Clan chose to stay where he had made them, in the land between two rivers. Hese Getamase had worked hard to forge his people and make a beautiful home for them. As he saw that it was good, the Master of Breath swept his right hand in a circle and built a place of rest for himself. Surrounded by a vast beaver ruin and across a great swamp, ran a long, narrow lake that connected two mighty rivers, the Alabamu and the Chickasha. There, on a high bluff overlooking the ancient lake, Hese Getamase created what all would call the place of coverings. He placed 12 oak trees in a wide circle. When he had arranged them perfectly, Hese Getamase created the greatest tree of them all and placed it in the center. Hese Getamase told these oaks to keep their green leaves through all the seasons, and decreed that the one he had placed in the center would grow to the top of the sky. With his fingers, Hese Getamase tangled the branches of the mighty oak trees he had placed in a circle and bound them to the branches of his special tree. This created a covering to provide shelter and prevent his children from climbing to his home before it was time for their spirits to join him there. The trees threw shade upon the ground, and the earth underneath their coverings was clean and cool. Sweet acorns fell there in such numbers that they piled upon themselves and had to be pushed aside before one could walk through or sit down to rest. None lasted for long, however, because acorns were eaten by every animal in the forest. And when the animals feasted there, all did so peacefully and with consideration for each other, because they knew this was what Hesegetemase expected of them. The Master of Breath had made it known that all clans were welcome there at any time, but there was a specific law that was to be observed without exception. When under the coverings of Hesegetemase, all present were to be kind-hearted and patient. Each clan was to seek deep understanding of the others. All were to use words of joy and gratefulness and praise. When plans were made about how the clans would work together and how the people would prepare for winter, chiefs and members of fire councils came together under the center tree. Hesegetemase would also be there to watch and listen closely to everything that was done or said. Everyone felt the Master's presence, and so everyone carefully considered each word before speaking aloud. This was how things were done in the days when the earth was young and people were kind one to another. But there came a time when Svetni, the evil one Hesegetemase, cast into the swamp and allowed to rule under its foul waters, began to cause trouble. Where harmony had once existed between brothers, Svetni created discord. Where families had only known trust, the evil one stirred suspicion. And though generosity had been their way, Svetni introduced the clans to jealousy. One day, during this season of discontent, a loud burst of sound was heard across the land. As the clans gathered at the coverings, they looked to the biggest oak, the tree in the center, and saw that its body had split. The crack was only the size of a warrior's finger, but it was deep, and it slowly widened as everyone watched in alarm. Accusations began to fly, and arguments intensified, but before blood was taken, the voice of Hesegetemase, as if carried by thunder, sounded within them all. "Stop this fighting," they heard. "I did not create your hearts for trouble." There was a cry then from many of the people, for all knew Hesegetemase's chosen tree was being rent in two because of his displeasure with them. At that very moment, the old people tell us, a warrior named Sevas stepped forward with a longbow of golden oak and strung it quickly. Holding a single arrow up and into the sunlight, all eyes were drawn to the arrow's stone. Sharpened to a keen edge, its shape was a study in perfection, each side tapering to a thorn's point at its tip. But most incredible was the astonishing color of the arrow's stone. Almost aglow in the sunlight, the arrow's head was whiter than snow. Of the broadening crack, the warrior said, "Though the grain of the tree springs from the same root, its wood has now decided to disagree. By going in different directions, neither side is as strong as they once were together." Some were nodding, and all were quiet. "Not only have the two sides chosen a course that will make them ever weaker," Sevas continued to explain, "but they have now opened themselves to a future in which they will become weaker still. Without protection, this crack is an entryway for crawling things to journey into the tree's heart. If that pathway is not blocked, the heart will be captured, The enemy will then be free to consume it from within, and the tree will die. "Can anything be done?" a warrior asked. "Is there anything we can do?" another woman offered. For a moment, he said nothing, and tears began to flow from the people, for they were very sorry for what they had caused, and they were ashamed. Finally, the warrior spoke. "I have come to bind you together, to make all things new." With those words, he walked from the center tree and did not stop until he had taken as many strides as there are fingers on the hands of 25 warriors. Reaching one of the 12 trees, he turned, planted his feet, drew his bow, and let the arrow fly. The white arrowhead buried itself firmly into the crack of the chosen tree. There were exclamations, followed by stunned silence, as the warrior returned. Carefully, he reached for the arrow shaft and twisted it, easing it out of the crack without the arrowhead. "The arrow stone," he said, "has gone into the deepest part of the tree's wound. There, each side of the stone will begin binding together the two sides that should have never been apart. This tree is now a symbol of peace. It will continue to grow, but only you will decide whether or not the healing wisdom begun this day will continue to bind your own wounds of foolishness." The old people say that when Savas spoke his final words, he placed the bow over his shoulders and began to climb up the very tree he had just saved. He climbed until they could no longer see or hear him, and all present knew he had returned to his father, Hesegetamase. From that day forward, all the great chiefs would travel to the coverings on solstice, the day the sun stands still. There, they would light a council fire and speak in honor of the warrior who brought peace to their people. The gathering was always ended with a ceremonial binding of the wound. As the blaze turned to embers, a single arrow stone, the most beautiful and valuable of all they carried among them, was selected. Together, the great chiefs would press the symbol of their commitment to Hesegetamase and to each other into the ancient wound of the massive tree they called the Peacemaker Oak. Now, Chapter 1. Keely Higgins was bent at the waist, lightly touching her dark hair with the tips of her fingers. "Why did I even wake up?" she groaned. "My head is about to explode." The old man sitting next to her on the metal bench crossed his arms and frowned. "Is it a sinus thing?" he asked. "Or an I had too much to drink kind of headache? Could be from tension. Tension will cause them. You know, that kind comes from your shoulders, up the back of your neck and over your head. Those are from tension. So if it's from tension, I'm sure it's a bad one." Keely sat up and turned stiffly to face the old man. Staring at him through cloudy eyes, she paused for a moment. Then, taking a deep breath to demonstrate her patience with his questions, she answered, "I've had a cold for 3 weeks. Yes, I drank too much last night. And I've been told that stressful environments create tension. Might this be considered a stressful environment?" The old man grinned. "My point," she continued, "though I'm not sure why I feel compelled to make one for you, is that, now that I think about it, my headache is probably the tragic consequence of combining all three. My nose is stopped up, I am hungover, and I'm in jail. So, yes, all three, sinus, alcohol, and tension. But thanks for asking." With that, Keely considered the conversation finished. Lifting her feet to the bench, the young woman wrapped her arms around her knees and positioned her face in such a way as to be shielded from any further interruption. The two were surrounded by bars, seated on the far side of an area approximately 15 by 40 feet. The absence of beds and the substantial size of the locked space suggested a temporary function. A double row of benches was fastened firmly to the cement floor, with one situated across the back wall, which was also solid concrete. The seating was illuminated, but not so sharply as the brightly lit area near the locked door. "It is rather exciting to be here." The old man's comment broke the brief silence. Keely turned her head, peering up from her self-made cocoon with one eye, and saw his arms were still crossed and that he had leaned back against the wall. He appeared to be quite relaxed, almost happy, she thought. Certainly he was at ease. As she watched, he turned this way and that, looking around as if this were one of the most interesting places he'd ever seen, before saying, "Yes, a jail cell can be a remarkable tool." Yeah, it's remarkably horrible," Keely said. "And exciting? I don't even know what you... A tool? What does that... Oh, my head. Never mind." She went back into her cocoon, her aching head cradled in her hands. Standing, the old man stretched and yawned loudly. A muffled "shh" came from Keely's huddled figure. The old man's eyebrows lifted in an expression of pure innocence. "I'm sorry," he said, although he was not. "I didn't catch what you just said," he finished, although he absolutely had. Keely's words were still muffled, but her response was delivered with much more energy. "God," she wailed, "can you please shut up for a minute?" "Certainly," he said a bit frostily. "If you're going to put it that way, of course I can." With that pronouncement, the old man turned away from Keely while crossing his arms and tightly clamping his right hand over his mouth. For several seconds, he rocked back and forth. Had anyone been watching, they might have been confused, for it would have been apparent that the old gentleman was laughing uproariously, but to himself, and without making a sound. He wore blue jeans and a white T-shirt with leather flip-flops. His longish, snow-white hair framed a deeply tanned face and the most startling eyes Keely had ever seen. In fact, they were the first thing she'd noticed after being placed in the cell. The old man's eyes were blue, but it was a brighter shade of blue than she had ever seen. It was as if his eyes had been encased in crystal. There was a clarity to them that Keely was unable to define. She had heard of eyes that sparkled, but always considered that specific description a way of referring to excitement reflected in a person's face. But this old man, his eyes really did sparkle. He had already been in the cell when Keely was locked in during the early morning hours. When the door had shut behind her, the officer quickly departed. Keely simply stood by the door with tears streaming down her face. Vomit had soaked the front of her blouse, and a swelling red knot was evident on her forehead. She had been angry, afraid, and drunk. Now her head pounded ferociously, but she was beginning to recall those first moments in the cell. The old man had stood when she walked in, Keely remembered, and he had said something. What was it? Oh, yes. He had bowed slightly and said, "Welcome. Come in and rest." I've been waiting, and I'm glad you're here." Weird. Had he really said that? Or did she imagine it? Her recollection was murky at best. Nevertheless, what the old man said penetrated the fog in her brain and brought her back to the present. "You know," Keeley said, as she lifted her head with a sigh, "I'm sure I'll regret asking, but why is a jail cell a remarkable tool?" The old man grinned. "When a life is spinning out of control, few things bring reality into utter focus as effectively as a jail cell. Oftentimes it is a lack of proper focus that allows a life to spin out of control in the first place." "Proper focus?" Keeley asked with a hint of suspicion. "What do you mean, proper?" The young woman did not lose the old man's gaze as she straightened and leaned against the back wall. He sat down beside her and considered his answer for a moment before speaking. "Lots of people believe they lack focus," he said, "when focus is not what's missing at all. For instance, at least part of why you find yourself in jail at this moment proves how effectively you were able to focus last night. Unfortunately, you focused on vodka tonics." The old man patted her on the hand. "Many people say they can't focus because they worry all the time." He chuckled. "You see, focus, it isn't their problem, because worry is focus. It's focus on the wrong thing. When we worry, we lack proper focus." Keeley stared at the old man for a moment through half-open eyes. "Who are you?" she said. "Jones," he said, and smiled. Then, nudging her playfully with his shoulder, he added, "Not Mr. Jones, just Jones." She didn't return the smile, but watched as he stood and stepped to the brightly lit area near the cell door. "A jail is also a near-perfect starting gate," he said absently as he ran his hand along the steel bars and poked his finger into a welded joint. Keeley's eyes narrowed. She wanted the old man to shut up. Why wouldn't he just be quiet and let her go back to sleep? She knew that the only way to shut him up was to be unresponsive, and so decided that she would not say another word. Almost immediately, however, Keeley blurted out another question. "Why a starting gate?" she heard herself say. When Keeley asked her question, she frowned as if she had eaten something distasteful. For some reason, the old man thought that was funny and laughed, motioning for her to stand and join him at the door. "Come here, young lady," he said. "Move into the light." He was only a short distance away, but held his hand out toward her. Keeley did not want to stand or even shift position, but felt oddly compelled to do as this man, Jones, asked. Reluctantly, she stood and almost immediately sat back down and leaned against the concrete wall. With her eyes closed, Keeley groaned. "I can't do it," she said. "I feel like I'm going to throw up." It was a moment or two before Keeley realized that the old man had not responded. Opening her eyes, she was taken aback to see him in the same position, right hand still reaching forward, and in the same place as he had been when she'd attempted to stand. There was one difference, she noted. Jones was no longer smiling. Neither was he frowning, the young woman decided. Instead, the expression on his face was one of concern, or urgency, or longing, Keeley thought. In any case, she strongly sensed the older man's determination. Choosing not to think about it any longer, Keeley closed her eyes again. "Hey!" Keely jumped, startled. The old man had practically yelled at her, and if she hadn't felt so badly, she'd have yelled right back. But a low snarl was the best she could muster. "What?" "Don't quit now," he said. "Come on, try again." Keely was about to end the conversation with a rude yet crisply articulated comment, but as she gathered breath for the effort, the old man tilted toward her at an impossible angle. Forgetting what she was about to say, Keely blinked hard and looked closely. His right hand remained outstretched, but with his left, Jones had gripped a bar of the cell. He was leaning as far as the span of his arms would allow. The old man wiggled his fingers toward her and said again, "Come on." To Keely, it was a ridiculous visual. Here she was in a jail cell, and this old guy was reaching out for her like she was in the water, sinking or needing help or something. "I'm drowning, aren't I?" "Yes," Jones said simply. "Yes, you are." And now, Chapter 2. 0. It was a word that perfectly described the amount of sense this phone call was making to me. It was the middle of the night, and I was not yet fully awake. "What?" I managed to croak, requesting the information be repeated. I wasn't certain I had heard correctly. "Who?" Again, I asked the caller to restate the information. "Why?" This I asked several times. True, I was in a fog, but the news she was attempting to deliver was almost incomprehensible. "When?" Not that I cared. At this point, I was stalling for time, struggling to think clearly, but it wasn't working. This made no sense. Or, as I stated earlier, 0 sense. Was this someone's idea of a joke? I turned the clock on the bedside table toward me. It read 3:27, a time that is either late at night or early in the morning, depending upon who you are. For me, it was both. As a writer and a speaker, I often rise early to peck away on my computer keyboard in the pre-dawn silence. On the other hand, flight delays or long drives occasionally cause me to crawl into bed about this time. And upon those occasions, I consider it late. Crossing the room, I quickly pulled on the blue jeans I'd left draped across a chair and headed to the closet for a shirt. "Are you going to your office?" Polly said sleepily. "And did the phone ring?" "No to the first question," I replied in the darkness. "Yes to the second. And as an aside, good grief, I wish I could sleep like that." Despite the circumstances, I smiled and shook my head, acknowledging to myself once again how vastly different my wife and I were in so many ways. This way had practically become a family joke. A hurricane couldn't wake her up. Me? Drop a feather on the floor, I'm out of bed, dressed, and ready to go. "If you aren't headed to your office, why are you getting dressed?" She shook off the sleep and sat up to turn on the lamp. "And who called at—" Polly leaned over to look at the clock. 3:29 in the morning? Now, fully clothed, I approached her side of the bed and turned off the lamp. "Well," I began, "it's one of those good news, bad news kind of things." "Okay," she said, waiting. I kissed her on the head. "The good news is that Jones is back. The bad news, however," I took a deep breath inside, "is that apparently the old man is in jail." There was a faint orange glow in the eastern sky. I was driving into the sunrise and just past the halfway point between my home in Orange Beach, Alabama, and Clanson, Florida. Unable to quickly find it on a map as I'd hurried from the house 90 minutes before, I was nonetheless unconcerned about finding the small town. Even without help from my trusty map of the southeastern United States, I'd left my driveway with no doubts about the trip. Such are the miracles of GPS. Not only does the global positioning system provide turn-by-turn instructions about all aspects of a drive, the technology apparently bestows confidence upon the driver as well. And for someone like me, one of society's directionally challenged, that's a big deal. As color began to fill the horizon, I glanced at the screen in the dashboard. The straight path route I had chosen, I realized, was taking me north of what some referred to as Cracker Kingdom. The name is spoken with admiration and nod to the original Florida crackers who first populated the area as pioneer settlers. Searching for a new life, they began to arrive after Spain traded Florida to Great Britain in 1763. Legend has it that the name Cracker was given these people as a reference to the cracking of the long rawhide whips they used to round up wild cattle. The area, though marked by the occasional small town, is still mostly untamed wilderness. A combination of palmed prairie and hardwood swamp, Cracker Kingdom's desolate roads can make for an unusual adventure. Driving through the area after dark, one is reminded of scary stories from childhood. Tales so vivid that decades later, in a place like this, healthy imaginations can run wild. Even today, every now and then, someone will swear to having encountered a hatchet-wielding escapee from the insane asylum from whom they barely got away after they slowed their car to pick up a hitchhiker who turned out to be a ghost girl in a prom dress with a golden arm. In the daylight, however, this unspoiled stretch of Florida has some of the most beautiful scenery in the state. Perhaps, I've often thought, the real reason it remains so unspoiled is because its two-lane roads are rarely used by visitors en route to the Gulf of Mexico. With its moss-draped trees and alligator-infested backwaters, this forgotten treasure seems practically invisible to outsiders. Instead, they seem to prefer the traffic of several unbending four lanes that run north and south, connecting Interstate 10 and whatever beach they've selected for vacation. These highways were clear-cut through the landscape years ago and have since been cemented into place by vast walls of convenience stores and fast food joints. In any case, for whatever reason, most tourists drive the straightest shot they can find. As the top edge of the sun became visible, my musings turned to the reason for this drive. I was unsettled, having no idea why the old man had been jailed, and couldn't imagine what he might have done to deserve it, but I would get him out, or be there when he got out, or something. Jones had inserted himself into my life decades ago. To say that I was at loose ends during that time would be understating the situation by a large degree. I had been 19 when my mother, after a long bout with cancer, had finally succumbed. Shortly after, my grief-stricken father, in an otherwise survivable automobile accident, had managed to follow her into the afterlife by not wearing a seatbelt. Suffice it to say, I was no financial genius at the age of 19. It did not take me much more than a year to run through the $2,500 my parents' life insurance policies paid out upon their deaths. My father had been a minister, my mother a homemaker, so there were no houses or cars, no land or jewelry, no stock certificates or baseball card collections or jars of cash buried under cabbages in a garden. No, the life insurance was my entire inheritance. Since I already owned an old car, I bought a trailer with the money. Mobile home is far too fancy a description for the ancient wobbly box of very thin sheet metal with holes in the floor I acquired. Still, however, I couldn't afford it. Inconveniences like electric bills and paying for food began to get in the way. First, I sold the car and got a small used motorcycle. Within a year, I had to sell my trailer, but I wasn't really concerned. Having gotten $1,500 for it, I was practically rich. After all, I still had my motorcycle. Oh, and I bought a tent. My thinking at the time was, hey, I'm single. I have transportation, a roof over my head, and cash in my pocket. What more does a guy in his early 20s really need? What more? Apparently nothing, because several months later, that's exactly what I had. Nothing. So I moved to the beach. To be clear, I did not move to a house on the beach. I moved to the beach. I lived on the beach, in the sand. I knew I was alone, but it didn't take too long for me to become sad and angry as well. Today, as strange as it may seem to the tourists, convention goers, and the vast flocks of Michigan or Wisconsin snowbirds who visit year-round, back then, Orange Beach, Alabama was not a year-round place. It's probably inconceivable to most that during the 1970s and early 80s, the tiny resort communities along the panhandle of Florida and the Alabama Gulf Coast became ghost towns in winter. Restaurants closed and shops were boarded up. Almost everyone in Orange Beach and our sister city, Gulf Shores, hunkered down, counted the change left in tip jars, and hoped the money they had made from March to mid-October would carry them through until the following spring. Me? I had no tip money, but I ate a lot of fish. When the old man stepped into my life, a couple of more years had passed, and I was sleeping most nights under the Gulf State Park Pier. Today, I still live in the area, Orange Beach, Alabama, and the pier is still here, now the longest anywhere on the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, hurricanes have required it be given an update or two since that time. One of the more interesting facelifts to me is the newfangled strip slat decking. All wood, the idea is that in the event of a hurricane's high winds and water, the slats will blow away, leaving the concrete structure of the massive pier intact. Back when I had quietly requisitioned the pier as my home, the whole thing was a cement company's dream. There was no wood. Even the decking was comprised of enormous slabs of concrete set end to end on colossal pilings. As people walked excitedly out onto this beautiful landmark, an above-water reef that stretched far into the Gulf, they all had their heads up and their eyes glued to those already fishing. For almost 2 years, Jones was the only person who'd figured out that I had a tiny home under that pier. Just beyond the parking lot, below the first concrete slab, right where it began to angle up, I burrowed under a concrete girder. Behind the massive crosspiece was where my hiding place was created. All the work was done with my hands and a small shovel, and in truth, I'd have been easy to find, if anyone had known where to look. Through the years, I've been asked many times how I was able to turn my life around. Usually someone will put it like this: how did you escape from under the pier? It's a funny question to me, as if they assume I was trapped under there and almost never saw daylight again. On the other hand, I see their point. In a way, I was trapped, because how I lived at that time became who I thought myself to be, scruffy and unkempt, without much hope or direction, and with anger quietly bubbling under the surface of my soul. Then Jones showed up, and I began to see a little daylight in my life. Curiously, Jones never told me what to do. He only asked questions and made observations. Yet it was with these tools, one a chisel, the other a hammer, that the old man dramatically expanded my thought process. Remember, this was the guy who told me, you can't believe everything you think. At the time, the concept rattled my brain, but that one statement, as odd as it seemed at the time, pointed my life in a particular direction. It eased me onto a pathway that would have me on a constant search for new answers, better solutions, ones that lay beyond what many experts had already accepted about how it was done or the best way to do it. The truth I finally understood in the statement, "You can't believe everything you think," eventually led me to a mission of helping other people move into the light, just as Jones had done for me. By the way, I didn't just come up with that "move into the light" phrase. That, too, is a direct quote from Jones. Actually, it was one of the things he said to me when we first met. Maybe it's because there really were sodium vapor bulbs illuminating the sand just outside my home, but honestly, it was a long time before I connected those words with the darkness that I'd been living in and his part in saving me from it. He was a crafty old guy, funny sometimes too, but I can't say he was particularly tactful. Once, I came at him with some statistics in order to argue the point of a story he had told me the day before. When I finished my prepared volley, the old man laughed and told me I had done well for someone who had collected the argument's research in less than 10 minutes. "Numbers alone can tell a story without context," he said. "Decisions made without context rarely reach their potential." Listening closely, I became aware that perhaps my debate victory had not been as decisive as I'd thought. Jones continued, "Reading, listening, being quiet occasionally, quiet enough to deeply consider what you're learning, these are ways one can wring context from what had previously been mere fact. Commit to these activities and you'll possess an advantage that will make itself known in every area of your life." He paused. When his eyes narrowed a bit and a mischievous grin crept across his face, I knew what was coming. Everything the old man had said so far could have been listed in column A, Jones with a chisel. Now, I figured, I was about to experience Jones with a hammer. Sure enough, he pounded home his point with this gem. "Facts and data are usually the default position for people who are not working on themselves." Wow. Okay, I got it. Here's another example of Jones using his considerable wit to cover a direct message he wished to convey. During the time I was living under the pier, I had been washing boats with 2 other guys in a marina. We were working on a huge sport fishing yacht when they suddenly offered me the princely sum of $5 whole to jump from the boat's tuna tower, a lookout position 42 feet above the water. To win the prize money, however, my leap would have to be over the dock and into the next boat slip 15 feet away. Without hesitation, I climbed the tower and jumped. As might be expected, I managed the 42 vertical feet quite easily. Once airborne, however, I sensed the 15 horizontal feet might contain a higher level of difficulty. Though I was free-falling at the time, my calculations proved to be correct, and I was reminded once more of the adage, "close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades." I was about an inch shy of clearing the dock completely. Unfortunately, that inch connected with my left forearm. Nothing was broken, but the scrape was impressive. Also impressive was the sensitive concern about my well-being offered immediately by my friends who, before I even made it to the surface, were loudly announcing they were not going to pay because I had failed the attempt. Nice. That evening, I was walking the beach with Jones and moaning about my bad fortune. Why in the world did I do that? I asked myself aloud. Though I had not meant the question for him, the old man chuckled and answered immediately, saying, "I think you let your want to get overwhelmed by your should I." I laughed and shrugged it off. "Oh, well," I said, "everything happens for a reason, right?" With the same chuckle as before, he responded, "Oh, sure, but sometimes that reason is because you weren't thinking clearly and did something stupid." My eyebrows went up, and he added, "Keep your head fixed on principles that will guide your life. Otherwise, your mind and body will drift, and you won't know it until it's too late. Consider the things you'd like to accomplish in the future and how tragic it would be to end up an inch shy on all of them." Glancing at the GPS in my Ford truck, I saw that I was less than 10 minutes away from my destination, and Jones weighed more heavily on my mind than ever before. By the dozens, it seemed, fleeting thoughts and episodes from the past were flitting through my consciousness, each remembrance separate and contained, every scene individually complete in my mind's eye. In reality, I suppose, it all happens in an instant unless we dial into a particular event. I thought again of that much younger version of myself and an admonition I'd received at that time from the old man. Earlier I mentioned being scruffy and unkempt. Well, I was. As Jones would say, not a judgment, just an observation. It was 11 a.m. on a weekday and time to clean fish for Nancy, the owner of Sea and Suds. I was about to walk up the beach and had on blue jean cut-off shorts and a T-shirt that was particularly wrinkled. Neither, I am certain, had been recently washed. Jones was sitting in the shade of a nearby palm when I emerged from underneath the pier. I told him where I was headed. "Just a suggestion," he said, "but you might want to grab another shirt. Latin has seen better days." I stared at him and responded, "I'm just cleaning fish. The fish don't care how I dress." The old man laughed and remarked, "Well, you got me there. That is entirely true. But the truth of the thing is a different matter." He paused to see if I was listening. I was, and he took the opportunity to give me an incredibly valuable example of proper thinking. "You are surely right," he began. "The fish don't care nothing about the way you dress. Those fish don't care how you act when you're at Sea and Suds or what you do when you ain't even close to the place. However, you are working for Nancy, a lady whose livelihood depends upon how the customers of her restaurant perceive her employees, what they do, and how they act. Patrons of a restaurant who see food prepared by someone who's not at least as clean as they'd like their food to be, well, they tend to find another place to eat. When they leave and don't come back, that affects the livelihood of the restaurant's owner. That livelihood, the money your boss makes from that restaurant, is what pays you. Without a successful business owner, you are out of work. As an employee, the fish cleaner, you are one of the first people your boss's customers see. If the fish cleaner is messy and not particular about how he dresses, or even if his clothes are washed, the customers are likely to think, maybe those fish aren't too clean either. Fish that aren't entirely clean can make a person sick. Folks know this, and wisely stay away from any fish they suspect might not be cleaned properly. If your boss's customers decide they'd rather not risk eating fish that might not have been cleaned properly, your boss's livelihood is diminished. And when she doesn't have the money to pay a fish cleaner, she cleans the fish herself. Which means... Jones let that last part hang there until I filled in the rest of the thought. Which means, I said, that I'm out of work. He smiled and winked. I turned and motioned for him to follow me back to the pier, which he did. Looking both ways, we ducked underneath, and soon I was into the plastic storage container I used for clean clothes. While I was changing shirts and combing my hair, he left me with this. Noting a person's messy appearance at work is just an observation, not a judgment. But observations over time, added together and weighed carefully in context, do lead to judgment. It's usually the quiet and unspoken kind, but it is still judgment. And in today's world, this kind of judgment becomes the difference in yes and no, hired or rejected, laid off or retained, promoted or passed over. And most folks don't have a clue as to what happened one way or another. As I smiled at the memory of how Jones had been so on the mark back then, I thought about how long it had been since I'd seen him. 6 years? 7? I wasn't certain, but knowing it wouldn't be long now, I turned into the parking lot of the Clanson Detention Center. So, prologue, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of Just Jones. That's the third in the Noticer series, and it's available September 8th. It's available to pre-order right now, and I would appreciate you absolutely doing that. I think this is the best of the Noticer series. I think you're going to like this one the most. And very excited that you hear the rest of the book or read the rest of the book, whatever is appropriate for you. Just Jones. I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. Hey, quick question. Where do you seek wisdom? And allow me to suggest wisdomharbor.com. That's wisdom, H-A-R-B-O-U-R. So no, you are. This is not mine. This is ours. Okay, so go there now. Go to Wisdom Harbor right now. There's a tour you can take. There's a 30-day free trial. People are using this with their families, with their children, with their businesses, and even schools are using it. It's become just an awesome tool that people are really enjoying. That's wisdomharbor.com. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing that tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, smile while you talk, even if you are behind that mask. And make sure you have a positive answer to the question, hey, how's it going? And so, until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Battery-powered fans provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional financial consideration provided by unnecessarymusicalversions.com. At unnecessarymusicalversions.com, we record, produce, and make available complete collections of songs that have already been done perfectly, only to have some moron think they can do them better than the original. Are the albums any good? No, they are not. Do the albums sell? No, they don't. Then what's the point, you ask? The point, my friend, is that people who think they can sing pay good money to studios like ours to have themselves recorded. That's where we come in. For a not-so-modest fee, Unnecessary Musical Versions will record and produce literally anyone. This week's special is Andy Andrews sings the Staedtler Brothers. From the golden throat of a man who never sang anything in his life, you'll hear all the Staedtler's greatest hits. But the class of '57 had its dreams. We all thought this bed of roses that I lay on, where I was taught smoking cigarettes and watching Captain Kangaroo. Don't tell me I've nothing to do. Yes, Andy covers every single one of the Staedtler Brothers' top 10 songs. You'll hear Whatever Happened to Gene and Tex and Roy and Rex, the Durango Kid. Oh, Elizabeth, I long to see your pretty face. I long to touch. Do you know you are my sunshine? And would you do it one more time for me? Yes, friends, it's all the Staedtler Brothers hits, and Andy Andrews does all the parts by himself. Just listen to this artistry. I'll go to my grave, loving you, loving you, loving you, loving you. I'll spend all my days loving flat tops, sock hops, Studebakers, Pepsi, please. Ah, do you remember these? It's an album you won't want to remember. Andy Andrews does the Staedtler Brothers. Order now from unnecessarymusicalversions.com.